Sarah, you're such a disappointment. Even Dad's inheritance won't be enough to fix the mess you've made this time. The words sliced through the air of my parents' formal dining room like a blade, spoken with such casual cruelty that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. But there it was again, my mother's voice, sharp and dismissive, directed at my younger sister who sat hunched over a stack of papers, her hands trembling as she tried to organize what looked like legal documents. I stood frozen in the doorway, still holding my car keys, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the heavy curtains. Sarah looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and hollow, the kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks of sleepless nights. She was only 28, but in that moment she looked decades older. Her usually perfectly styled blonde hair hung limp around her shoulders, and her designer clothes, the ones that had always been her armor against the world, looked wrinkled and ill-fitting. The contrast was stark and heartbreaking. At the head of the table sat my parents, looking like judges at a tribunal, while Sarah appeared to be drowning in shame. The scene before me triggered something primal and protective, but beneath that immediate reaction was something else entirely. A cold, calculating clarity. Because as I watched this family drama unfold, as I saw my sister being torn down and my parents positioning themselves as reluctant saviors, I realized that the ground beneath their feet, the very foundation they thought was so solid, was about to shift in ways they couldn't imagine. They had no idea that the inheritance they were so casually discussing, the money they were planning to throw at Sarah's problems like it was their own personal piggy bank, was already beyond their reach. The fortress I had built around grandfather's legacy was impenetrable, and they were about to discover just how thoroughly I had outmaneuvered them. I had come to my parents' house in Westchester that Tuesday for what I thought was a routine family dinner. Mom had called earlier in the week, her voice unusually urgent, insisting that we all needed to sit down together as a family. She'd mentioned something about Sarah going through a difficult time, but our family had a long history of Sarah going through difficult times, so I hadn't thought much of it. I'd driven up from my apartment in Manhattan expecting the usual. Sarah would need money for some new venture, Mom would guilt me into helping, and Dad would sit back and let it happen while maintaining his air of patriarchal authority. What I discovered instead was a financial catastrophe so massive it made Sarah's previous crises look like playground disputes. The papers scattered across the mahogany table told a story of systematic destruction. Credit card statements with balances that made my stomach clench, loan documents from institutions I'd never heard of, and most chilling of all, what appeared to be correspondence from some very serious people about very serious money. My parents had been funding this disaster for months, draining their own accounts, mortgaging their house, and now they had reached the end of their rope. The inheritance from my grandfather Edward, the man who had raised me to understand the difference between building something and destroying it, was their last resort, their final solution to a problem that had spiraled completely out of control. The full scope of Sarah's situation unfolded over the next hour, like a horror movie in slow motion. My father, Richard, had assumed his usual position of authority at the head of the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he methodically worked through a thick manila folder. His voice was steady, businesslike, as if he were presenting a quarterly report rather than outlining our family's descent into financial ruin. The gambling started small, he explained, not looking at Sarah as he spoke. Online poker, some sports betting. We thought it was just a phase, something she'd grow out of. Sarah flinched at each word as if she were being physically struck. Then it escalated. The high-stakes games in Atlantic City, private rooms where the minimum buy-in was more than most people make in a year. My mother, Helen, had positioned herself as Sarah's reluctant defender, though her version of support was laced with passive-aggressive barbs. We tried to help her, Marcus. We really did. We sent her to counselors, we monitored her accounts. We even considered having her committed. She reached across the table to pat Sarah's hand with a gesture that looked more like pity than comfort. But addiction is a disease, darling. It's not something you can just wish away. The numbers were staggering. Sarah had accumulated gambling debts totaling $480,000, money owed to a network of bookmakers and loan sharks who operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal. The interest rates were predatory, compounding daily, and the consequences for default weren't just financial. Dad showed me photographs on his phone, pictures of our family home, our cars, even images of Sarah leaving her apartment building. Someone had been watching, documenting, preparing. These people don't negotiate, Dad said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They don't accept payment plans or sob stories. They want their money. All of it. Within the next 3 weeks. Or, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah spoke for the first time since I'd arrived, her voice cracked and small. I never meant for it to get this bad, Marcus. It started as just a way to make some quick money. I had a system. I thought I could beat the odds. She laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of any humor. Turns out the house always wins. And I was never as smart as I thought I was. The conversation then shifted to their proposed solution, and that's when I understood the true purpose of this family meeting. My parents had done their homework. They'd consulted with lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors. They'd explored every option: second mortgages, business loans, liquidating their retirement accounts. Nothing came close to covering the debt. Except for one thing, my inheritance from grandfather Edward. Dad pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker and bound in expensive leather. Your grandfather's estate, he announced with the gravity of a pronouncement from on high, is worth approximately $3 million. Stocks, bonds, real estate, collectibles, it's a substantial portfolio that's been growing steadily since his death 2 years ago. Mom leaned forward, her eyes bright with desperate hope. It's the perfect solution, Marcus. We use the inheritance to pay off Sarah's debts, clean the slate, give her a fresh start. Then, as a family, we help her rebuild. We can all contribute to replacing the money over time. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They had mapped out my entire financial future without consulting me, treating my inheritance as if it were a family emergency fund rather than a personal legacy left specifically to me by a man who had seen through their enabling behaviors decades ago. They had charts showing how the money would be distributed, timelines for repayment, even projections for how the family investment would benefit everyone in the long run. But what struck me most was not the presumption. I had expected that. It was the complete absence of any real accountability for Sarah or any meaningful change in the family dynamics that had created this crisis in the first place. This wasn't a solution, it was a massive band-aid that would allow everyone to return to their established roles without learning anything or growing in any meaningful way. I sat there listening to their presentation, watching Sarah alternate between shame and a kind of desperate relief, and I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that their perfect solution had been impossible for over a month. The fortress was already built, the moat was already dug, and the drawbridge had been permanently raised. The silence that followed my parents' presentation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Dad pushed a single sheet of paper across the polished table, an authorization form that would give them power of attorney over the inheritance accounts. The paper seemed to glow under the chandelier light, a simple document that represented the complete surrender of everything my grandfather had worked to build. All we need is your signature, son, Dad said, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and manipulation that he'd perfected over decades of closing business deals. One signature, and we put this whole nightmare behind us. Sarah gets a second chance, the family stays safe, and we all move forward stronger than before. Mom nodded enthusiastically, her manicured hands clasped together as if in prayer. Think of it as an investment in our family's future, Marcus. Grandfather Edward would have wanted us to stick together, to take care of each other. Her voice took on that syrupy quality she used when she was working particularly hard to get her way. He was all about family loyalty, wasn't he? I looked at Sarah, who was staring at the authorization form like it was a life preserver thrown to a drowning person. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and I could see the tremor in her hands as she reached for her water glass. The weight of her desperation was almost tangible, filling the room like a toxic fog. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the old familiar pull, the ingrained response to be the dutiful son, the reliable brother, the one who always stepped up when the family needed him. It would be so easy to sign that paper, to be the hero of this particular story, to buy their love and gratitude with grandfather's money. The old Marcus would have already picked up the pen. But the old Marcus had died in a lawyer's office 6 weeks ago, killed by the discovery of a betrayal so profound it had reshaped my understanding of my entire family. And the new Marcus, the one sitting at this table, listening to their carefully rehearsed performance, had been preparing for this exact moment. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a slim folder. The leather was simple, understated, without the gold embossing or expensive binding of my father's presentation materials. I placed it gently on the table. The soft sound it made somehow louder than my father's earlier theatrical gestures. "Before I respond to your proposal," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I think there's something you should know. Something about the inheritance and about grandfather's true feelings regarding Sarah's situation." Dad's eyebrows furrowed slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "What are you talking about, Marcus? What could you possibly know that we don't?" I opened my folder and removed a single sheet of paper, a letter in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. I had discovered it among his personal effects, filed away in a manila envelope marked, "For Marcus, when the time comes." "Grandfather knew," I said simply, letting the words hang in the air. "He knew about Sarah's gambling. He knew about the money you'd been quietly funneling to her for years. And he knew that eventually, you'd come for his inheritance to solve a problem that can't be solved with money." Sarah's face went white. Mom's mouth fell open in a perfect O of shock. Dad leaned back in his chair as if I'd physically pushed him. I began to read from the letter, my grandfather's words carrying across the years with devastating clarity. "My dear Marcus, if you are reading this, then the day I have long dreaded has finally arrived. Your parents have discovered that their decades of enabling Sarah have led to consequences they cannot manage, and they are looking to my legacy as their salvation. Do not let them. Sarah's addiction is not a problem that money can solve. It is a problem that money has created. Every bailout has only made her stronger in her destructive habits and weaker in her resolve to change." The room was deadly silent now. Even the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to have stopped. I continued reading. "The inheritance I am leaving you is not meant to be a family emergency fund. It is meant to be your foundation, your security, your freedom to make choices based on your own values rather than others' expectations. Protect it, Marcus. Protect it from those who would use your love for them as a weapon against your own future." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. When I looked up, 3 pairs of eyes were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to rage to desperate disbelief. "There's more," I said quietly. "Grandfather didn't just warn me about this moment. He helped me prepare for it." From the folder, I removed a second document, official letterhead from the law firm of Morrison, Blake & Associates. The words at the top were clear and unambiguous. "Irrevocable Trust Agreement, the Edward Brooks Memorial Trust." 6 weeks ago, I said, watching my father's face cycle through confusion, understanding, and finally, fury, I followed grandfather's advice. Every asset, every account, every piece of property from the inheritance has been transferred into an irrevocable trust. I am the sole trustee, and the trust documents explicitly state that no funds can be used to pay gambling debts or to enable addictive behaviors. Dad shot to his feet so violently that his chair toppled backward. "You what?" The words came out as a roar that seemed to shake the crystal in the china cabinet. "You went behind our backs? You betrayed your own family?" I remained seated, my hands folded calmly on the table. I protected grandfather's wishes, just as he asked me to. The explosion that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in our normally controlled, image-conscious household. It was the sound of 30 years of careful facade finally cracking under the weight of desperate reality. The aftermath of my revelation transformed our elegant dining room into a battlefield. Dad paced back and forth like a caged animal, his face cycling through shades of red I didn't know were humanly possible. Mom sat frozen, staring at the trust documents as if they might spontaneously combust if she looked hard enough. Sarah had completely shut down, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "This is unthinkable," Dad sputtered, running his hands through his carefully styled silver hair. "Unconscionable. Your own sister is in danger, real, physical danger, and you're hiding behind legal technicalities?" He spun around to face me, pointing an accusatory finger. "What kind of brother are you? What kind of man?" Mom finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Marcus, honey, surely there's something we can do. Trusts can be modified, can't they? There must be provisions for family emergencies." Her eyes were wide with the kind of desperate hope that makes people believe in impossible things. "You're the trustee. You have discretion. You can make exceptions." I pulled out another document from my folder, a copy of the trust's spending guidelines that I had drafted with my lawyer. "Actually," The trust is very specific about what constitutes an acceptable distribution: education expenses, medical emergencies, home purchases, business investments with solid fundamentals. Gambling debts are explicitly excluded, along with any expenses that could be seen as enabling destructive behavior. Sarah looked up for the first time since I'd started reading grandfather's letter. Her face was streaked with mascara, her eyes hollow and red. "So that's it then?" she said, her voice barely audible. "You're just going to let them kill me?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything, despite the years of drama, the financial chaos, the lies, she was still my little sister. The little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who made me friendship bracelets out of colored string, who looked up to me like I was her personal superhero. "Sarah," I said, leaning forward, trying to reach across the vast emotional distance that had opened between us, "no one is going to kill you. This isn't about abandoning you. This is about not enabling you anymore." She laughed, a harsh sound that was more sob than humor. "You don't understand, Marcus. These aren't credit card companies or banks. These are people who break legs for a living. They've already made it clear what happens if I don't pay." She pulled up her sleeves, revealing a series of purple bruises on her forearms. This was just a friendly reminder. Next time won't be so gentle. The bruises changed everything and nothing simultaneously. My protective instincts screamed at me to throw open the trust, to write whatever check was necessary to keep my sister safe. But my grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, words he'd spoken to me just weeks before his death. "Sometimes, Marcus, the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the natural consequences of their choices. Pain is a teacher that kindness often isn't." Dad had been making phone calls in the corner, his voice low and urgent. He hung up and turned back to us with renewed determination. "I've spoken with our family attorney, James Morrison. He says there are ways to challenge an irrevocable trust, especially if it can be proven that the grantor was under duress or not of sound mind when it was created." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had prepared for emotional manipulation, for guilt trips, for tears and threats. I had not fully prepared for legal warfare against my own family. "Dad," I said, my voice still calm but with an edge of steel, "Grandfather was examined by 3 different doctors in the weeks before his death. All of them confirmed he was mentally competent. The trust was created with the oversight of 2 independent attorneys. You'll be spending money you don't have on a legal challenge that can't succeed. We'll see about that," he shot back. "We'll also see how the rest of the family feels about your selfishness. Your aunts, your cousins, the whole extended family. They'll know exactly what kind of person you really are." The threat of social exile was meant to terrorize me, but instead it felt oddly liberating. For years I had bent over backward to maintain the family's approval, to be the dutiful son who never caused waves. The prospect of finally being free from those expectations was almost exhilarating. Mom tried a different approach. She came around the table and knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in hers, a gesture she hadn't made since I was a child. "Marcus, I know you think you're doing the right thing. I know grandfather filled your head with ideas about tough love and consequences, but sometimes being right isn't the same as being good. Sometimes family means bending the rules." Her words were carefully chosen, designed to hit me at my weakest point. My lifelong struggle to distinguish between being right and being good, between protecting myself and protecting others. For just a moment, I wavered. Then I thought about the pattern. How many times had we been here before? Different amounts, different crises, but always the same dynamic. Sarah would create a disaster, my parents would scramble to contain it, and I would be expected to provide the resources to make it all go away. And each time, the lesson learned was that there were no real consequences, that family meant infinite chances and unlimited bailouts. "Mom," I said gently, removing my hands from hers, "bending the rules is what got us here." Grandfather understood that. He saw this moment coming years ago, and he gave me the tools to handle it correctly. I stood up, collecting my documents and placing them back in the folder. The trust is not changing. The money is not available for gambling debts. But that doesn't mean I'm abandoning Sarah. I turned to my sister, who was watching me with a mixture of hope and fear. "There is money available in the trust for rehabilitation, a real program, a real commitment to change, the best facility in the country if that's what it takes. But it has to be your choice, Sarah. And it has to be a real commitment, not just another performance to buy time." Sarah's face crumpled. Marcus, you don't understand. I can't just disappear for 3 months. These people want their money now. If I'm not here, if I'm not making payments. Then we call the FBI, I said simply. Loan sharking is a federal crime. Death threats are a federal crime. If these people are as dangerous as you say they are, then this is a law enforcement matter, not a family financial matter. The suggestion hit the room like a bomb. Sarah went white. Dad stopped pacing. Mom actually gasped. We can't do that, Dad said quickly. Think about the publicity, the scandal. Think about what it would do to the family name, to my business. And there it was. The real reason they wanted to handle this privately, with family money, away from the scrutiny of law enforcement. It wasn't just about protecting Sarah. It was about protecting their carefully constructed image of respectability. I looked around the room at my family, at their fear, their desperation, their stubborn refusal to accept that the old rules had changed. I felt a profound sadness settle over me, but beneath it was something else. Relief. The weight of their expectations, their constant crises, their emotional manipulation, all of it was finally lifting from my shoulders. The offer stands, I said quietly. Rehabilitation, with full funding and support. Or we contact law enforcement and let them handle the criminal aspects of this situation. But the trust remains intact, and grandfather's money will not be used to enable gambling addiction. I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. You have 48 hours to decide. The 48 hours that followed my ultimatum passed in a strange, suspended silence. I heard nothing from my family. No phone calls, no emails, no desperate midnight visits to my apartment. It was as if I had been surgically removed from their lives, excised like a tumor that was interfering with their ability to function in the way they always had. But silence, I discovered, was not the same as inaction. On Wednesday evening, I received a call from Diana Roberts, the attorney who had helped me establish the trust. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. Marcus, we need to meet immediately. Your family has filed a motion to freeze the trust assets pending a competency challenge. They're claiming your grandfather was suffering from dementia when he signed the trust documents. I sat down heavily on my couch, the phone suddenly feeling like it weighed 50 pounds. Can they do that? They can try, Diana said. It's a long shot, but it will tie up the assets for months while we fight it. More importantly, they've hired Patterson and Associates. They're the most expensive trust litigation firm in the state. This isn't a desperate gamble anymore, Marcus. This is total warfare. We met the next morning in Diana's glass-walled conference room, the city skyline stretching out behind her like a backdrop for a corporate thriller. She had spent the night preparing our defense, and her usually immaculate desk was covered with medical records, legal precedents, and witness statements. The good news, she said, spreading the documents across the conference table, is that your grandfather was extraordinarily thorough. He had 3 separate medical evaluations in the weeks before signing the trust: cognitive function tests, neurological exams, psychiatric assessments. All of them concluded he was not only competent, but exceptionally sharp for his age. She pointed to a thick folder. He also had the trust reviewed by 2 independent attorneys before signing, and he made video recordings explaining his reasoning for each major decision. It's going to be very difficult for them to prove incompetence in the face of this much evidence. But, I asked, because there was clearly a but coming. Diana's expression darkened. But Patterson and Associates doesn't take cases they can't win. They're not just challenging the trust on competency grounds. They're also claiming you exerted undue influence over a vulnerable elderly man, that you manipulated him into changing his will to benefit yourself at the expense of other family members. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. The idea that my relationship with my grandfather, the most genuine, uncomplicated relationship in my life, could be twisted into something manipulative and predatory was almost unbearable. They have evidence? I asked, though I couldn't imagine what evidence could exist for something that had never happened. They claim to have witnesses who will testify that you isolated your grandfather from other family members, that you discouraged him from spending time with your parents and Sarah, that you fed him negative information about their characters and financial responsibility. Diana leaned back in her chair. It's a classic undue influence playbook. Take a close relationship and reframe it as manipulation. I thought about all those afternoons in my grandfather's workshop, the quiet conversations about life and values, the way he lit up when I visited, Had I somehow prevented my parents and Sarah from having similar relationships with him? Or had they simply been too busy with their own dramas to invest in the quiet, patient work of really knowing him? There's something else, Diana continued. They're not just asking for the trust to be invalidated, they're asking for you to be removed as a potential beneficiary entirely, claiming that any inheritance obtained through undue influence should be forfeited. The scope of their legal assault was breathtaking. They weren't just trying to access the money for Sarah's debts. They were trying to destroy me completely, to rewrite the narrative of my grandfather's final years so thoroughly that I would be left with nothing. Diana must have seen something in my expression because her voice softened slightly. Marcus, I need you to understand something. This kind of litigation can take years. It will be expensive, emotionally brutal, and very public. Are you prepared for that? I stared out at the city beyond the windows, thinking about the choices that had led me to this moment. I could surrender now, agree to some kind of settlement that would give my family access to at least part of the inheritance. It would be the path of least resistance, the choice that would preserve some semblance of family relationships. But it would also be a betrayal of everything my grandfather had tried to teach me about integrity, about building things that last, about the difference between enabling and loving. What do I need to do? I asked. Diana smiled grimly. Fight. Fight harder and smarter than you've ever fought for anything in your life. Over the next several weeks, I got a crash course in high-stakes litigation. Diana's team worked around the clock, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, building our defense against my family's increasingly desperate attacks. I learned that my parents had mortgaged their house to pay for their legal fees, and that Sarah had somehow managed to convince several of my extended family members that I was the villain in this story. The most difficult part wasn't the legal maneuvering or the financial stress. It was the gradual realization that my family was willing to destroy me to save themselves. They weren't just attacking my legal right to the inheritance. They were attacking my character, my relationships, my very sense of self. But something unexpected happened during those dark weeks of depositions and court filings. I discovered that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The foundation my grandfather had helped me build, not just financially, but emotionally and morally, was solid enough to withstand even this assault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My uncle Thomas, my father's younger brother who had been estranged from the family for years, contacted Diana's office with information that changed everything. He says he has recordings, Diana told me over the phone, her voice barely containing her excitement. Voicemails your father left him months ago, asking him to lie about your grandfather's mental state if anyone ever asked. Apparently, your dad has been planning this challenge since the day your grandfather died. The recordings were devastating. My father's voice, captured in digital clarity, laying out a plan to contest any will or trust that didn't benefit the family the way he thought it should. He spoke about my grandfather's stubbornness and outdated ideas about enabling, and made it clear that he considered any inheritance that couldn't be used to solve the family's immediate problems to be fundamentally illegitimate. More damaging still were comments he made about Sarah's gambling, referring to it as manageable and under control, statements that directly contradicted the picture of desperate crisis they were painting in court. When Diana played the recordings for me in her office, I felt a complex mix of vindication and profound sadness. I had won, but the victory felt hollow. These recordings would destroy my family's legal case, but they would also destroy any remaining illusion I had about my father's character. The end came swiftly once Uncle Thomas's recordings were submitted to the court. Patterson and Associates, faced with clear evidence that their clients had planned a fraudulent legal challenge, quietly withdrew from the case. The motion to freeze the trust assets was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. My family's legal war was over before it had really begun, but the personal war continued for several more weeks. My parents, having exhausted their legal options and drained their savings on attorney fees, turned to increasingly desperate measures. They organized what they called a family intervention, inviting aunts, uncles, and cousins to my apartment to convince me to do the right thing. When I refused to participate, they began a whisper campaign, telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen my sister's inheritance and abandoned the family in their hour of greatest need. The social pressure was intense. People I had known my entire life began treating me with cool distance. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming. My own mother sent me a letter, handwritten, as if that would make it more devastating, explaining that I was no longer welcome in their home until I found my compassion and remembered what family means. Through it all, Sarah said nothing. She didn't participate in the legal challenge or the social campaign. She simply disappeared. And for weeks, I had no idea where she was or whether she was safe. The not knowing was almost worse than the hostility from my parents. Then, on a gray morning in November, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was Sarah's, but it was different, clearer, more steady than I had heard it in years. "Marcus, it's me. I'm in Arizona. I wanted you to know that I took your offer." She had checked herself into the rehabilitation facility I had researched, using the trust funds that were designated for legitimate medical expenses. She had been there for 6 weeks, working through not just the gambling addiction, but the deeper issues that had driven her to seek the adrenaline rush of risk in the first place. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew what Mom and Dad were planning. I knew about the legal challenge, the lies about Grandpa's mental state. I should have stopped them, but I was so scared, so desperate. I let them destroy our family to try to save me from my own mistakes." We talked for over an hour, the longest real conversation we had shared in years. She told me about her time in treatment, about the slow, difficult work of understanding how her addiction had hurt not just herself, but everyone around her. She apologized, not just for the gambling debts, but for years of manipulation, drama, and emotional terrorism that had held the entire family hostage. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said near the end of our call. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what Grandpa was trying to teach us. Sometimes the most loving thing someone can do is say no." 6 months later, Sarah completed her treatment program and moved to a small town in Colorado where she got a job as a bookkeeper for a local nonprofit. She lived in a modest apartment, drove a used car, and attended Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week. It wasn't the glamorous life she had once imagined for herself, but it was honest, sustainable, and entirely her own. My parents never apologized. They sold their house and moved to a retirement community in Florida, where they could maintain the illusion of comfortable prosperity on a smaller stage. We exchanged Christmas cards and the occasional brief phone call, but the easy warmth of family relationships was gone forever, replaced by the polite distance of acquaintances who happened to share a history. I threw myself into my work and discovered that the stress of family drama had been holding me back more than I realized. Without the constant crises and emotional manipulation, I had energy and focus I hadn't felt in years. My financial advisory practice grew rapidly, built on a reputation for integrity and long-term thinking that attracted clients who valued stability over quick fixes. On the anniversary of my grandfather's death, I drove up to the Vermont property that was now part of the trust. The farmhouse was exactly as he had left it, preserved like a museum of his values and priorities. I spent the afternoon in his workshop, running my hands over the tools he had taught me to use, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and wood stain. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains he had loved, I called Diana Roberts to discuss establishing a scholarship fund for young people struggling with addiction. It would be funded through the trust, supporting treatment and education for those ready to do the hard work of changing their lives. "Your grandfather would be proud," Diana said when I explained the program. "This is exactly what he meant when he talked about growing the seed rather than consuming it." As I sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, I thought about the price of integrity and the cost of family loyalty. I had lost the family I was born into, but I had gained something perhaps more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that I could stand alone, that my principles were solid enough to weather any storm. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "1 year clean today. Thank you for believing I could change, even when I didn't believe it myself." I smiled and typed back, "Grandpa always said the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." The inheritance had been preserved, but more importantly, its true purpose had been fulfilled. It hadn't just protected assets. It had protected the future, created space for growth and change, and taught the hardest lesson of all: that sometimes loving someone means letting them fall, trusting that they have the strength to get back up. In the end, that trust, not the legal document, but the faith in human resilience, proved to be the most valuable inheritance of all.